Hey everybody, day late. It's Thursday morning. Just got off of work, starting my 7 days off. So that's why I'm a little fresh. Um, picked up picked up an overtime day yesterday. So I ran short, and I didn't want to shorten the kind of this part two of a question that I addressed last week on the Bride of Christ. So let me give it to you this morning. There was some discussion about the Bride of Christ, and I had started off, which caused part of the discussion, by referring to a shirt that was popular 10, 15 years ago. At some of the youth group conferences, there were a number of kids that had these shirts on that said, "I'm gay for Jesus." This has nothing to do, and it had nothing to do with sexuality, gender identity, and any identity whatsoever. It was just kind of a play, a goof on loving Jesus and Jesus loving us and giving our lives to Jesus. That's all it was. There's no hidden meaning, there's no secret agenda. It's just a comment that was made dozen years ago, 10, 15 years ago. I brought that into conversation kind of as a Kickstarter to talk about the Bride of Christ, because the question was, what do guys think of being called part of the Bride of Christ? I'm not going back into this because I addressed it last week and look back on the video, but I did want to address a little about the Bride of Christ because there was some conversation about kings, queens, and brides, and why the Bride of Christ. One of the things that almost all Bible scholars, at least all mainline Bible scholars, agree is that the Bride of Christ, referred to in the Bible, refers to the Christian church. The Christian church being believers in Jesus Christ who have been reconciled back to God through faith in Jesus, from when Jesus was crucified through now and the future. The church, all the believers of all time gathered together, called the church. And most people, most scholars say this refers to the bride. Now, some questions came up. Isn't the Bride of Christ Israel? The Jews. Yes. And some people asked, the Bride of Christ is called the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. Yes. All these answers are yes. And the Bride of Christ, being in the church, is that it's never explicitly called the church, never explicitly called the Bride of Christ, but it's alluded to. And that's what I wanted to kind of bring out when we talk about the Bride of Christ. Christ is called in Scripture, the Bible, the Lamb, the Bridegroom, and we see a lot written in the Bible, Old and New Testament both, about marriage relationships. And all these are analogies, and the Bride of Christ is a metaphor for what God and Jesus have in relation to us. As a husband and wife relate to each other, that is the picture that God has for us, the church, Christians. In the Old Testament, when you talk about Jews, there was a covenant relationship God made with Israel. What covenant means is it means not a contract where you do this and I'll do that. A covenant is more a spirit type of relationship where you want to fulfill the contract. You want to fulfill the agreement because you want to. You have this desire to. You don't want to break it. That's a covenant. And you hear about marriage covenant. It's not a contract. You're in a marriage because you want to be there. You fulfill, and I don't know, I was going to say worship. and want the best. Serve your husband or wife because you want to. A covenant. In the Old Testament, God had a covenant with Israel. If Israel, you do this, then I will bless. Israel broke that covenant. But God still wanted them. He did not give up on Israel. The book of Hosea, a really interesting book that I don't fully understand, but Hosea the prophet is told to marry a prostitute who cheats on him. Marry a prostitute who cheats on him. Gomer is her name. And as Israel has prostituted itself, God's covenant people, God will always take them back. There's an allusion to marriage, the marriage covenant. New Testament, we see parables, the parable of the 10 virgins, God and the church, God and those who belong to him. In Ephesians, it talks about a husband and wife shall come together and the two shall become one flesh. As the church, an allusion, a metaphor, an analogy for Jesus and the church, husband and wife. In Revelation, the New Jerusalem, the bridegroom, the bride of the Lamb, an analogy for how God sees his relationship with the church, Christians, believers in him who have given their life to God through faith. This is what the marriage of the Lamb, the bride of Christ, the bridegroom and the bride is. An analogy, a metaphor, an impression of how God sees us. That's what the bride of Christ is. It's an analogy. You know, while I'm on it, before I close, there is in the book of Revelation, there's a lot there, but one of the things that comes out is what's called the millennial reign, this 1,000-year reign. In ancient Israel, when you had a marriage, and we'll talk about the rapture too for a second, I'll give you a 30-second version. One of the ways that marriages happened is the bridegroom would be betrothed. The bride, would be betrothed to the bridegroom. In many ways, that was when the betrothal is when the marriage started. What the bridegroom would do is prepare a place for the bride to live. Jesus says, and I go and prepare a place for you. The bridegroom didn't get to decide when the bride was ready to come, when the place was ready for his wife to start life together as one flesh. The father of the bride, or the father would say, okay, now you can go and get your bride. The Father is the one that decides when we're ready to go. In the rapture, it says God the Father, nobody knows except the Father, when the place God has prepared for us is ready for us to come. And we talk about the millennial reign. After the rapture of the church, the 1,000-year millennial reign will begin, us and Jesus. In ancient weddings, there was a great feast that occurred when a couple was married, bride and a bridegroom. The wealthier you were, the more extravagant and longer the celebration was. In heaven, after the bride of Christ, comes to heaven, the 1,000-year reign, the millennial reign, the party and dinner afterwards begins. You see, it's an analogy. And it's important for you to remember this. Don't get caught up on kings, on queens, on literal brides, on consummations, on anything like that. Words cannot always describe what awaits us in life with God. And God speaks a lot through analogy, through metaphor. All the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we hear over and over again, the kingdom of heaven is like. So, I hope this explains the bride of Christ a little bit more. If you have any more questions, keep them coming. I love what you guys have asked and the comments you made so far. And let's see if we can learn more. To grow in knowledge, but also to become better servants for God as we await that glorious day. Have a wonderful week, and remember, we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at FL Compass Church. And as always, check out all the updates, www.flcompasschurch.org. See you Saturday.